Hi, this is Jim Clemmer. Thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have you drop by for the next hour. As of this morning, we had over 500 sites signed up in 30 countries, and we know there are a number of groups meeting together to hear this webinar. So I'm going to start first of all with framing a little bit of what you're going to see is quite different approaches, and there really is a need for a new approach. If we take a look, for example, at this massive study that was done by the McKinsey organization over a 10-year period and involved thousands of senior executives giving their input on a variety of organizational issues, one of the questions that they were asked is, how important is leadership development? Well, this is a little bit like motherhood. So you see a vast majority, 3/4 of them said, yeah, it's really important. Here's the really telling statistic. When then asked, how well is the organization doing leadership development, less than 10%, single digits, felt the organization was doing it effectively. So clearly there's a need for something different. And I guess I hesitate to use the word revolutionary, but some of what we're going to talk about, especially in the first part of our broadcast around strengths-based leadership, really is very revolutionary and different. And the original rebel who pointed the way to this kind of approach was Peter Drucker, who way back in 1967 in a book called The Effective Executive made this point, that we can't build performance on weakness, we can only build on strength. He called it foolish and irresponsible, a misuse of human resources to try to build on weaknesses, because all it really is a limitation and nothing else. So when we think about what we typically think about as performance improvement, what usually comes up is it's all about fixing weaknesses. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll begin to get a real strong sense of how we want to move very sharply away from that kind of approach. Now for me, this has been a bit of a change. We've been working with Zenger Folkman for the last year and a half. I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about how we reconnected. And I've written a number of books on leadership, 7 in all. And as I look back now, I see that the underlying assumption, like the underlying assumption of most training needs analysis or performance appraisals or performance development plans of all kinds, was really trying to fix weaker areas. And so I've come to realize that while the basic concepts and principles still are applicable, how we apply them and what we focus on is absolutely vital. We want to move away from this focus on weaknesses. So what we're going to cover here today in a short, quick overview is I'll talk a bit more about the background of how we connected with Zenger Folkman. Then we're going to take a city bus tour. I love the analogy of a city bus tour. My wife Heather and I love to travel, and one of the first things we'll do, we get into a major city. A few years ago we were in Rome, loved the city, and took a bus tour all around, took a look at the major sites. Well, there's 2,000 years of history in the city, and in about an hour or a couple of hours, we did a broad overview of the whole thing. Well, that's a little bit like today. We're going to do a very broad overview of some pretty deep topic areas. So we're going to talk about, first of all, 5 keys to building extraordinary leaders, and the need for evidence will be one. We'll talk more about the idea of strengths. We'll look at how perceptions are really all that a leader has and forms their reality. We'll talk a little bit about the 360 work that all of this is based on, and that the tool, the extraordinary leader that I'll be talking about, is built around, and how different it is if you're familiar with 360s from most others. And then we'll look at how exactly do you develop strengths. And it is quite a different approach. The idea of cross-training is pretty revolutionary. We'll look at that. And then in the last 25 minutes or so, we'll take a quick tour. We'll go to another part of town, and we'll look at some of the keys to building a coaching culture that has emerged a little bit later on out of this work of Zenger Folkman. So that's a quick look at where we're headed. The session is primarily geared towards people in these sorts of roles. I know we have a wide variety of people on this call, but this is predominantly who I'll be speaking to and the kinds of application that I'll be addressing. So let's look at Zenger Folkman. They've been around now for just over 10 years and have been using evidence-based methods. You'll see that it's a pretty comprehensive system that is being used, and there are 4 books. I'll refer to them a little bit later on, but a lot of this work, and if you're looking for more detail on what we're covering here today, you can find it in the books. And so over these 10 years then, they have been building and customizing and developing all of this further. Jack Zenger and I go back actually to 1981, which is for me, many years ago, if you've seen me lately, certainly a long time ago. And I've loved the work that we did with Jack at the Achieve Group, my company, and his company, Zenger Miller, back in the 80s and 90s. And then in about 12 years ago or so, around 2000, 2001, Jack connected with Joe Folkman, who has a deep history, and you'll see a little more of that as we go, in the whole area of psychometrics and the use of 360s particularly. So Jack and I reconnected about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and I've always had great respect for Jack. He is a tremendous leader in the field, and the values that he and his team have are very powerful. I've been a follower of strengths-based for a long time now with positive psychology, with the Gallup organization, Marcus Buckingham, but this is the first time I really saw a system that put together a strong methodology of how to do it. And it's based on a lot of research and evidence. It's very much aligned with our own coaching, inspiring kinds of philosophies and the work that we've been doing for years now around culture and leadership development. So you'll be seeing me talk about statistics and some studies and work that's been going on over the last 8-10 years. I'll be quoting from some of these organizations. This is a quick look at some of the organizations. Some are fairly new at using this approach. Others have been around for some time. Here's an example of one of the earliest clients. Kevin Wilde is head of learning and development at General Mills, who are seen as one of the top 25 companies in the world and a number of studies in leadership development. And here's what he has to say about now 8 or 10 years of working with this kind of approach and with Zenger Folkman. He talks about how it really blends research with strong practical application, but it challenges conventional wisdom, as you're going to see, but it's made a huge difference in their organization. So if you're interested in getting more information, the very first book that was written is called The Extraordinary Leader. It was updated about 5 years back. And then The Inspiring Leader came next. The Extraordinary Coach, we're going to be pulling a fair bit from that this afternoon. And then we're also going to be looking at how, or more of the updated material that's come out of the more recent book, How to Be Exceptional. So let's jump in here and take a first quick stop on our bus tour to the use of evidence for leadership development. Let me start here with a bit of a case for the need, why we need to take a more evidence-based approach. Every once in a while, and just last week in preparation for this presentation, I took a visit to Amazon and I typed in leadership. Here's what I got, over 110,000 books with leadership in the title. How many more books are there on leadership? Many of my books on Amazon don't have the word leadership in the title, but they are leadership books. Type in the phrase leadership books in Google, and what I got was 650,000 hits. So there's a lot of stuff around on leadership. And in fact, you can get leadership by the numbers, 4 seasons, 5 pillars, 9 natural laws, 100 greatest ideas. It can be by example, Gandhi, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Churchill, even Tony Soprano. You can get leadership as an art form. It's talked about as a science, or it's even spiritual. Sometimes it's brought across as a secret, secrets of Santa Claus and Attila the Hun and other leaders. Or it's centered on something. So principal, students, heart, follower, whatever it may be. Here's a really interesting take. It doesn't take a genius to be a leader, apparently. And here's a book, a very short, fairly interesting, and reasonably cheap book about studying leadership. But the ultimate authority, Teletubbies, Color the Leader. So obviously we're having a bit of fun with this, but it's to say we got to cut through a lot of this noise and this tremendous amount of opinions and ideas on leadership to what really works. And that's what Jack and Joe set out to do when they first started down this road and wrote the Extraordinary Leader book back in, they began the research around 2000, 2001. And they had 2 years of work looking at this big database that Joe had developed over decades now of 360 evaluations being done on 20,000 leaders. And what they did was to set out to say, well, there's lots of models on competencies, for example. You can shuffle cards, you can choose from dozens of competencies, you can get together in a room with executives, as I have facilitated those sessions, and just pick competencies out of the air. But you can come up with all kinds of stuff about what leadership is, but what is it that really matters in the end? And that's where we ended up with looking at how can we measure it, how does it correlate to performance, and what are the competencies that really matter, and how can we build strengths? And so what came out of that was these sets, these 16 competencies that are clustered in 5 major areas or clusters here. We sometimes think about this as tent poles, or an old-fashioned canvas tent with character at the center pole and then the 4 corners. If you want more research on all of this, these 2 books will give you lots more, and an article that appeared in Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago called Making Yourself Indispensable. Well, today I'm just going to give you the broadest overview. There's a huge amount of this kind of research that we can, and we'll send you some follow-up links with white papers and other materials in it that shows you some of this research. But here's some of the studies that have been done. Is when you look at those competencies and you look at who are the top leaders to the worst leaders, you see correlations to turnover, for example. So here we have highly effective leaders have twice the retention of poor leaders. Or you look at employees that think about quitting. We see big difference between the very top leaders and the very worst leaders. We often think about this as the tip of the iceberg phenomenon because, of course, you have those employees who think about quitting and do leave, do quit, and you have those who think about quitting and then decide to quit but don't leave. So they quit but stay. And that's a massive problem that shows up in employee engagement, for example. So when you look at employee engagement, what comes out time and again is that the best predictor of engagement is what I'm experiencing day to day on the job from my leader. And so we see, for example, this study of 23,000 leaders, very poor leaders had very low levels of engagement. Good leaders, well, they did okay. They were all right, mediocre, but okay. Extraordinary leaders, much higher levels of engagement. This study I find really fascinating is looking at job performance or satisfaction with job, pay and job security. And this is in the same organization, everybody getting paid the same way, the same pay bands, but vast differences in our satisfaction based on my experience with the leader. Well, it continues. Sales, huge difference in sales. Goes on to safety. Those of you concerned about health and safety, we do a lot of work in that area, especially in the mining and distribution sectors. Looking at customer satisfaction, leaders that don't even see customers yet have a huge impact on customers by the kind of environment that they create. And net income. One of the white papers we can connect you to in our follow-up email is called How Extraordinary Leaders Double Profits. And this comes from one of the large banks that I cited earlier, being able to isolate the huge difference that extraordinary leaders have on profitability. So that's a quick whirlwind overview of a huge body of research and studies that have been done, many of them commissioned specifically for organizations, in other cases aggregated studies, just showing you the overall impact of leadership. So how do we build strong leaders? How do we make leaders go from good to great? Maybe they're sitting in the middle of those charts. How do we get them to the top end of those charts? Well, leveraging leadership strength is proving to be by far the most effective way of doing this. Here's one organization that's been using this approach now for 5-6 years at Yale University. And Michael Peel here is talking about how it's not by focusing on weaknesses, but in fact by focusing on strengths. Let me give you a quick example to illustrate this. This is a story, comes out of the world of positive psychology. And Martin Seligman's work at the University of Pennsylvania and all the branch that has branched off since that time. So here's a teacher gave an assignment to class to take a sheet of paper, put your name at the top of it, and pass it to the student next to you. This then gets passed all around the class, and every student is asked to write on what they think the strength is of the student that their name is at the top of the page. And so it goes around the classroom. And one particular student, his name is Ryan, found this enormously powerful and reaffirming and supportive, and it really made a big difference to him. In fact, he went on years later to join the Marines and unfortunately was killed in action. His body was flown back to the small town where he grew up and where he went to school. And at the funeral, one of his friends was pallbearers, recognized the grade 7 teacher, and came over afterwards and said, you know, that exercise you did in grade 7, that was really cool. That really had an impact on a lot of us, but especially on Ryan. And Ryan's mother came over and echoed that and said, you know, as a matter of fact, in the things that were sent back after his body was returned was his wallet, and we went through and found that original sheet of paper with those strengths still written out on it, smudged and bent and twisted and used in all kinds of ways. So here's the question. What if the teacher had asked him to write down weaknesses and improvement suggestions? Would he still have that in his wallet all those years later? I'm going to guess not. One of the things we do in our workshops as we discuss this concept is we talk about these questions. And you may want to, if you're here with a group, you may want to have a bit of a discussion around this after this presentation. Why is it that we focus on fixing weaknesses? Most performance appraisals spend all of 5, maybe 10 minutes talking about strengths, and then let's get into your improvement areas. Let's get into how we can help you get better, which typically talks about weaknesses. So what's the lingering effect of that? Well, in our culture development work, we use this slide many times and explore deeper. What kind of culture are we setting up? Are we setting up the old McGregor Theory X on the weakness side of things? People are basically lazy. You got to watch over them every step of the way. You got to supervise them. They're just trying to rip you off. Or are we looking for strengths and building on strengths? Because it's funny how we tend to get what we see. And my favorite story of that is a little girl riding in the car with her mother one day and says to her mother, "Mommy, where are all the stupid jerks and idiots today?" Of course, her mother says, "Well, they only come out when your father's driving." It's amazing how different people bring out different things in others. So if somebody is average at everything, and in our session we have a case study called the Richard's Dilemma. So Richard's pretty good all across the board. He's average. But we say, so what if he were to look at his effectiveness, look for strengths and weaknesses, but really create an action plan based on weaknesses or weaker areas? So here's 16 competencies. So he zeroes in on a couple of weaker areas. What's the impact of that going to be? Well, the discussion inevitably ends up saying, well, the best he's going to do is maybe raise those weaker areas to average. He's not likely to take them much higher than that, and the overall impact is going to be pretty ineffective. It's not going to amount to a whole lot. And so, in fact, when we're looking at this discussion of weaknesses versus strengths, we see that there is a time when we want to work on strengths, and we use the term fatal flaw. Now, what we mean by that, it's kind of a harsh term, but is if there's something that is fatal to my role as a leader, it's a flaw in my leadership, I need to address that. So clearly, if it stands out that starkly, I need to get that out of the basement. I need to focus on it. But a large majority of the time, that isn't the case. Here, by the way, the other part of this chart shows how a leader is rated overall if they have a fatal flaw. Well, they're only at the 18th percentile, so not very good at all. The flip side of this is, and the focus on strength, is the good news. You don't have to be a superhero to be an extraordinary leader. So when we talk about Richard's case, Richard doesn't have to try to get good at all the characteristics, which most competency models kind of give across the idea that, well, to get good, you got to get good at all of this, or you got to improve your weak areas, even though it may not be a fatal flaw. And so here's what the research has shown time and again. The database is now 500,000, over 500,000 360s done on 50,000 leaders, and this trend has stood the test of 10 years of time and constantly running these 360s, that if somebody, here's Richard, he's at no great strengths, profound strengths, that's at the 90th percentile, no big weaknesses either, he's just kind of middle of the road, doing okay. So out of 10 leaders, he'd be around number 6 or 7. If he took one area up by, so one of these strengths to the profound level, what the research shows is that he'll jump to the 64th percentile, 2 strengths to the 72nd percentile, and so on, so that 5 of the 16 strengths, and it doesn't matter which 5, will get him to the 90th percentile. Top 10 leaders by strengthening 5 areas to the profound strength area. So in fact, a number of the clients that I showed you earlier have tested and have done pre-post testing, have followed up 18 months later, sometimes another 18 months after that, and have a lot of data now showing over multiple years what's the impact as perceived by everybody else of leaders when they work on weaknesses. Good news here is they do show improvement. So people who work on weaknesses show some improvement. But what happens when you compare it to working on strengths? Well, in this particular aggregated study, we see that it doubles improvement rates. There's been some other clients and other studies have shown it even triples improvement rates. And so it really brings us back to look at a number of issues around why do we focus on weaknesses. But let's come back to the performance appraisal again. And Mary here is making a comment, Mary and her organization, which is in the medical devices, vascular access business, BARD. She talks about how over the last few years they've rethought this whole thing about strengths versus weaknesses, rebuilt their performance management philosophy, and are now looking to build strengths, and it's had a huge impact on the energy that people have for performance management. How many times people love to go to the performance management discussion, either giving them or receiving them? Not too many. But she then concludes to say, how many companies can say that? And of course, those of you in HR are constantly battling to get people to get their performance appraisals in because it's such a painful process for everybody involved. And most people kind of feel like it's a useless process because it doesn't bring about much change, the typical weakness approach that we use. All right, well, let's carry on then and take a look at how perceptions, sometimes you hear we base a lot of this work on the perception of the leader is based on 360s. You'll hear sometimes people saying, well, that's just their perception. That's not reality. But in fact, perceptions are a leader's reality. Here's a bit of research that shows just how true that is. This is showing how individuals rate themselves in their leadership effectiveness across the competencies versus how the other groups rate those individuals, and then it's correlated to predictability. So what predicts, what correlates strongest to all of those performance factors I showed you earlier, engagement, customer satisfaction, safety, etc. Where are the strongest correlations? And here they are. It's the very strongest is with the manager and then with the other groups. Now the difference between the other groups are not that great, but certainly when you get to self, half is accurate as the other is getting perceptions from others. Now that's because sometimes people are either too hard on themselves or too easy on themselves. It goes to either extreme. So the reality of leadership perceptions is that in an ideal world, in a totally objective world, people would weigh out each of our characteristics, look at us as leaders, and form a balanced impression of us from that. Of course, what really happens is one particular trait or a couple of traits stand out. And so the key question becomes, what is that trait? Is that trait a profound strength, which grows the others and helps brings them up, so we call that the halo effect, or is it a fatal flaw which shrinks the others, which is more of the horns kind of effect? So where are we? Knowing that and getting objective data and input to that is absolutely vital to our improvement. So how do we do it? Well, we do it with the 360 tool, and all of this data and all of this work is built around a strength-based 360, which you'll see in a few minutes is quite a bit different than most 360s, for those of you familiar with 360 tools. It's a tool that's been in use now for some time. It's widely used, different kinds of 360s, and when it's used effectively, it really can have a major impact. But there are lots of different ones around. There are a lot of similarities, but we want to look at some major differences. One of the big problems with most 360s is that it's weakness-based, and it's looking for gaps or training needs. and it tends to create dislike of the process. Not a lot of change occurs from it. If you don't have a fatal flaw, it's useful if you have a fatal flaw, which about 20, 30, 25, 20% of the time managers do have fatal flaws and need to deal with it, which means the vast majority of people are missing the power of focusing on strengths because they're zeroed in on weaknesses instead, and they end up feeling beat up by the process. So Joe brought to the partnership back in the beginning a deep history with working with 360s, and he actually did his dissertation on 360 tools and the data, and he was for decades a founding partner in an organization that specialized in 360s. But then as he teamed up with Jack in 2002, he took a completely different look and completely revised and revamped their approach to using 360s to a strength-based approach. So let me give you a bit of a sense of what that means. So first of all, it is simplifying the competencies, getting rid of the dozens and dozens and hundreds, and we've seen some incredibly complicated models, different levels for frontline versus supervisors versus managers versus executives, and just a huge bunch of complication around competencies. So let's get it down to the ones that really predict what makes a difference. So 16 are the ones that showed to predict that. Let's compare to extraordinary levels, the 90th percentile, not just averages, so that we can see what it takes for someone to reach and stretch to that level. And let's use scales that don't allow enough differentiation and get us into false positives. And that one I'm going to illustrate a little bit more. Here's an example. So someone is being asked here to rate this person around whether they listen carefully and attentively. So a typical Likert 5-point scale looks like this. So I look at this and I say, yeah, okay, I'd say he does pretty good on that. So I'll give him a 4. I agree, he listens pretty carefully and attentively. The participant gets the feedback and says, hey, I'm doing all right, got a 4 out of 5. The strength scale looks like this. And so now we see that 3 is competent, 4 is a strength, 5 is outstanding. So the respondent looks at this one and says, oh, well, yeah, they do a pretty good job. I'll give them a 3. And so the participant says, well, I'm okay, but we can now see a greater differentiation. One of the big problems, those of you who worked with a lot of surveys before know that you often end up with this tight band of data in around the 4 level of the scale, and it doesn't give nearly enough differentiation. So this scale gives us a lot better, a lot more clarity about, is this just I'm doing okay, or is it a strength, or is it an outstanding strength? Makes it a lot easier for me to see that. So we also want to make sure we're measuring against key performance outcomes. Engagement is actually one of them that's used in here, but there's lots of others that can be correlated with. And we want to focus on building strengths, not just identifying gaps or weaknesses. And there's a number of ways in the 360 that that's done. We want to, this is point number 6, is how we can get away from having all those different competencies for different levels of the organization. And we can actually tailor this down to the individual job level. So what are the 4 competencies that are most critical for this individual in their job? And that's going to be different for the CEO versus a supervisor, for someone who's out facing customers versus someone who's analytical or in the IT area. Those are going to vary all around the organization, not just by levels. But that's the way we can really tailor this. We want to have the written comments. This links back to point 5 to make sure that we're not focusing on flagging just weaknesses. We don't just want a list of weaknesses. We want, is there a fatal flaw here? We want this to be simple. We've known some 360s can take up to an hour to complete, incredibly labor intensive. We want good, simple, intuitive visual feedback reports so it's easy to see and we know exactly where we're at. And we want to primarily look for ways to build strengths. What are the things that help individuals build their strengths? So with that kind of tool, with that kind of background, let's go on to our last section here of this piece on extraordinary leader and building on strengths with how do you do that? So how do you help somebody who's good in a particular skill area go to great? Linear, as we're going to see in a moment, linear training doesn't do that, which is more traditional training. Boeing is one company of many who've said that this cross-training approach I'm about to give you a quick overview of, and it's one that we need to spend a lot more time on, so here's a quick get off the bus, take a few pictures, and get back on, that this has had a major impact for Boeing and has had been, Dee here says it was a huge factor in their winning the Malcolm Baldrige Award for quality in the U.S. So here's the way we start to figure out what to work on and how to apply cross-training. So we start to look at, well, what's the leader's situation? This is back to what I said a few minutes ago. What competencies matter most? And how can we take 3 to 5 of those to the 90th percentile? So we take a competency or a couple of them. We then also take a look at what's the need for that role or position. So we typically ask for what are the top 4. And then another key element is what is the leader passionate about? What will sustain them and is something that really is what they're excited to work on. And so with that kind of background, or that kind of merging of those 3 areas, we end up with a leadership sweet spot or 1 or 2 competencies that really connect. And so when we have that, we can start to talk about cross-training. Cross-training, the idea comes from the world of athletics. If somebody is going to become a long-distance runner, then if they're already good, they're in the maybe 80th percentile already, they're one of the top runners in their field, they want to go to the Olympics. They want to go into the 90th or 95th percentile. Well, you wouldn't say to them, go out and run more. In fact, most world-class athletes would do these kinds of things, a variety of cross-connected activities that will help them mentally, physically, help them with stamina, help their body to be at peak performance. So that's the idea of cross-training. How this got mixed into to building strengths was way back in the early days of this research. One day Joe wandered into Jack's office and said, take a look at this, Jack. I've been crunching some numbers here, and I've seen that in our database, remember this is a database of 200,000 360s on 20,000 leaders, when somebody builds relationships and drives for results, if both of those are strengths, then if this one particularly is a strength, builds relationships, but drives for results is not, the amount of times that they're in the top 10% of leaders is around 12%. If the reverse is true, that they're strong at getting results, so they get it done, but they're not great at building relationships, well, it doesn't change much. It really only goes to 14%. Now, if you were to do the math on that, you would say, well, the 2 together, if somebody's at around, let's say, the 70th percentile, or really it's strong but not a profound strength, that the chances that they'd be in the top 10% of leaders, well, you add the 2 together, comes up to 26%. But this is where the magic began to happen, the idea of cross-companion or cross-training. What Joe actually found is where you have this profile, where individuals are strong at both of these, the chances that they're in the top 10% of leaders, well, what do you think it is? 50, 60, 72% of the time they show up in the top 10% of leaders. So there's some kind of connection between these two. There's some sort of synergy or a powerful combination that Joe began to look for across all of the competencies. And what he ended up doing was developing a competency companion development guide. And one of the examples we'll use here is, let's say someone gets feedback that says you're at the 75th percentile now in honesty and integrity, and might be scratching your head a little bit to say, well, I don't lie, cheat, or steal. My word is reliable. I keep my commitments. Why am I not at the 90th? Or how do I get to the 90th? Do I just be more open now, more transparent? What do I do to get to the 90th percentile on this particular competency? One that we see as the center pole of the tent. Well, for example, what we see through looking at statistical correlations on that particular competency is that assertiveness has the #1 correlation to it. So if you don't speak up, one of my previous books, Moose on the Table, was about this very problem, where people are kind of sitting on their hands, not declaring the moose on the table or the elephant in the room or whatever your favorite creature is. And so their overall rating for honesty and integrity is going to be lower, because we're not talking here about the character of the individual. we're talking about one of the key words in the definition, displays high honesty and integrity. Not judging your character and who you are, but do you come across with honesty and integrity? So there are a number of others that showed up in this study. And the heart of this whole approach is something called the Competency Companion Development Guide, or affectionately we call it CCDG. And here's an example from communications. So this is showing somebody who wants to go from the 75th to the 90th. I was working with a VP a while ago who had this very situation. And he said, Jim, I've done Toastmasters. I've had presentation skills training. I've gone to listening skills training. I've done all that stuff. So how do I go to the 90th percentile? Well, here he could choose now, and in his case he chose strategic perspective and involved others as two areas that he wanted to really build out further. And by doing that, if he does that effectively, he will be rated 18 months later or whenever he might do this again as being in the 90th percentile. So that's a quick look. Take a bit of a rest here. Quick bus tour around this part of town that has to do with strengths-based approach and something that's called the extraordinary leader. So let's now drive over to another part of town and let's take a look at culture, coaching culture, and what it takes to build coaching skills and to build a culture of coaching with real exceptional leaders. There are 6 keys that we're going to talk about here. And just before we get to talking about them, I want to set up a little bit like I did at the beginning of this webinar, the need for focusing on coaching to a much greater extent than we've been doing. So here's a large client in the telecommunications business, and like many of you, I'm sure, has been running engagement surveys, organizational surveys, morale surveys, etc., for many, many years. And here's a typical pattern that develops. You ask managers, how are you doing at coaching? They score themselves pretty high and feel like they're doing quite a bit of it. Ask the people reporting to those managers, how's your manager do at coaching? You tend to get a very different picture, that they don't feel like they get a lot of coaching, and what the manager thinks of as coaching is not what they think of as coaching. And in fact, that's the heart of the problem. This next slide that I'm about to show you here is one that I found incredibly useful as I look back on all the books I've written and chapters on coaching and coaching workshops that we've delivered. I think there's a lot of times we've gotten kind of confused between training, mentoring, and coaching. All 3 are important, but let's be clear about what it is that we're doing. And in this presentation and in the use of the tools I'm going to be talking about here and in the Extraordinary Coach, we're looking at that far right column, the coaching column, which is different than mentoring and different than training. There's a time when we need those others, but we're going to be talking today about how do we build more of a facilitative look at coaching. So for example, one organization that's been using this approach for a while now loves the empirical approach that I'll show you momentarily, and the tools, particularly the framework, the FUEL framework, which we'll look at. So where did this come from? Where does this work on coaching? Well, once again, in true Zenger Folkman fashion, it's based on research, based on evidence. Does coaching make a difference? And if so, what are the key skills that make a big difference in coaching? And so similar to what we saw earlier, there's 360 feedback that's been used here, 250,000 ratings of roughly 25,000 leaders. And we see a similar relationship to what I just showed you in cross-training, but in coaching, all of these become even sharper. It's quite striking how much sharper the differences are. So for example, if someone is rated as being pretty good in the 75th percentile at energizing others to achieve results, really kind of pushing others to get things done or inspiring them, but getting things done, but not so good at coaching and mentoring, only 7% of the time are they seen in the top leaders. If they're good at coaching and mentoring, but not so good at energizing others. People sometimes think, well, because this is all about coaching, that's going to be even higher. It's actually a little lower, the probability they'll be in the top 10%. Now here's where it gets really fascinating. You may remember the last time we showed the two numbers added up. Well, in that case it was 25% chance they'd be in the top 10%. Here it's even down to 11. But the last time we said, well, when they are together, 72% of the time they're in the top 10% of leaders. What we see here is that it's actually 85% of the time they are in the top 10% of leaders. So let's take a look at these. We're going to look at these 6 steps, or these 6 areas here in turn. And again, this is going to be a pretty quick run through. There is a follow-up couple of links and white papers that we'll send you as a follow-up to today, and you can get deeper into all of this. So first of all, setting expectations for coaching. Here again is part of the problem, the gap that we have. This particular study looked at how only 11% of employees listed their supervisors as someone that they would turn to for advice on problems at work. This is not advice on problems in life or just advice generally. This is for advice on problems at work. Clearly, there's an issue here, a gap. How do we create these expectations that leaders will be coaches? Well, we have found that connecting to some of the bottom line results in organization effectiveness, that it just makes good sense, it makes good profit, or performance outcomes are strong when we have good coaching. The more senior managers lead and model and sponsor this, the more likely it's going to happen. And how visible we make it, how we put it on agendas at meetings, it's part of the promotion process. We're highlighting success stories of strong coaching, and we're building it into performance and metrics and other kinds of scorecards. We looked earlier at some of the impact of leadership generally on outcomes. We see the same trend here, but even sharper. For example, this one on employee commitment. Dramatic differences between the worst coaches, who have an employee commitment of way down around the 12th percentile, to the very best coaches that are almost at the 90th percentile. That's an 8 or a 9 times difference between the very best coaches and the very worst ones. Impact on extra effort, again, we see dramatic differences. Or how are leaders rated overall as being effective supervisors based on their coaching skills? And again, we see the same kind of trend. Or how do I feel valued? Many organizations are doing all sorts of things to try to help people feel valued and engaged and so on. Well, the degree of coaching that I get from my supervisor or manager is a big part of how I feel valued. So how do we create a coaching structure and process? Well, some of the common traps to look out for, the alligators in the swamp that we got to be careful of. As coaches, oftentimes we just jump into discussions, don't really give it a lot of thought, and wing it. Big problem. Or maybe we're not really clarifying. So often this gets overlooked. What is it that the coachee wants from the conversation? Or is it purely a one-way, here as the coach is what I think. I'm going to give you these gifts of coaching, whether you want it or not. Airtime is a big indicator of whether this is a real two-way conversation or whether it's a conversation of discovery and mutual learning, or whether I'm confusing coaching, as with this next point, with mentoring or training. Because in mentoring or training, giving advice is important and is even key. But in coaching, we're trying to draw out and explore multiple alternatives. We're trying to understand the individual's commitment to change and build that commitment to change so that we can avoid the follow-up and accountability problem, where here we are 3 weeks later, following up, not much has changed, and we're getting frustrated, and it's a great indicator that the coachee doesn't own the outcome. So what's the process? What's the structure? Well, Zenger Folkman has built based on a lot of research, and you'll see some of the research, more of it coming up here momentarily, this 4-step model. So the F in the fuel model is framing the conversation. So what do you want out of this as the coachee? Where are we going to go with this conversation? What are the steps we're going to take here? Lots of questions in step number 2. Open-ended questions, not statements in the form of questions, like, have you tried this? How have you thought about that? Have you done? Well, those aren't really questions. Well, they're questions, but they're directing questions. They're not open-ended. So understanding, exploring, seeing what the situation is, and then exploring where the coachee wants to go and what success would look like and what some of the options and alternatives are. And let's brainstorm different ideas here, and then let's decide what to do from here. But again, keeping the ownership on the part of the coachee, so it's the coachee's plan, not the coach's, particularly the manager, if the manager is the coach. So this process has a guide for each of these steps. This is throwing up some examples of questions that might be asked, some of the steps, sub-steps that we might go through. So the extraordinary coach process has more depth and guide to it like that. And so some of the clients that have been using it, we hear time and again comments like this, that this framework, this fuel model, has been incredibly useful. And it's even actually done up on a laminated card as a job aid because it's just proving to be so useful. All right, well, let's carry on then. Get back on the bus, head off to the next short stop as we talk about providing coaching skill development. Now, what we find is that when it comes to coaching skill development, there's a couple of unique challenges. One is to help people unlearn, particularly if they've tended to meld together the idea of mentoring and training with coaching. So unlearning some of that and changing the concept of coaching and what coaching entails. So often our concept of coaching comes out of the world of athletics, and with the Olympics just completed, we probably still have a lot of this idea that a strong coach gives direction from the sideline, and some of those elements are accurate because the coach doesn't go out and touch the ball or get on the field, but others can be quite misleading. So that coaches a lot of times are really mentoring and giving advice, providing feedback, corrective kind of feedback, or try this or try that, often because the coach has a higher degree of wisdom and expertise. So as we're talking about coaching, it's not really, that's really mentoring. For us, coaching, well, I want to use this example. Here's a typical manager-employee interaction where the employee has a problem or an issue. You may be familiar with the idea of a monkey on the back. So it says, hey, boss, got this monkey, got this problem, and goes to the manager. The manager listens to it, maybe gives some advice, and expects the employee to do it, or takes the monkey on, puts it on their back. Where we want to move toward is creating a very different relationship so that through good questions, through encouraging some risk-taking and creative thinking and new approaches, the employee feels empowered and trusted to solve the problem. And the employee then owns more of it, takes on a lot more of the problem, makes decisions, and moves forward. So now when the employee comes along with, hey, boss, got this monkey, the boss can look at the employee and say, that's an ugly little monkey you have there. What can I do to help you solve that problem, rather than me taking it on myself? So what we've learned and seen around coaching is that many leaders tend to rate their coaching skills fairly high. It's a little bit like asking who here sees themselves as above average drivers. Statistics show that about 75% of people raise their hand and say, I'm an above average driver. That a lot of times leaders do much of the heavy lifting with advice and ideas and taking the monkey and putting it on their back, and that employees then have a really hard time seeing that as coaching. They see that as maybe problem solving or having the manager jump in and deal with it. They typically don't see that as coaching. So leaders lots of times in their one-on-one situations think of it as coaching, but it's really just dealing with an issue or having an update to a task. And so long-term development, oftentimes just the pressure of the moment, means the long-term development isn't given a lot of time. So how do we bring some science to this? And again, we see that this is someone out of the healthcare sector. I know we have a number of healthcare people on this call, and evidence-based medicine is key in healthcare, and we believe we need to move to evidence-based leadership as well. And so part of where this comes from is 360 data showing these 14 competencies typically show up time and again as being the distinguishing competencies, the ones that make the greatest impact either on the plus or the minus side. So that's part of where this has come from. Also, we've looked at other disciplines because for us, pretty well all of us I think on this call, coaching is a means to an end. It's a tool. It's not the reason that we necessarily exist or that the organization exists is to do coaching. But in lots of professions, that's not the case. Counseling, social work, psychotherapy, clinical psychology, those are all areas where the reason for that they exist is to provide some form of coaching. Now clearly there's some differences with those approaches, but there's a lot that can be learned from them. And so in the development of this approach, Zenger Folkman looked at first those differentiating competencies, the 14 that we just talked about, some recent brain research, stages of change research, and particularly motivational interviewing. And so motivational interviewing, which is quite heavily used in those counseling, psychotherapy kinds of fields, shows that the most effective conversations are when it's a collaborative conversation between two people as adult to adult, where the helper is being really facilitated and guided through the discussion rather than being given expert advice. And so their autonomy is being not only respected, but it's a central part of the whole conversation so that the outcome or the plan, the action plan, is owned by the coachee. So that you start to translate that into the approaches that we're talking about then. Well, we've got to get away from I'm the boss or performance management kind of approaches that say, well, here's what ought to be done. We've got to work with the coachee to a much larger extent. And we can't come in as a mentor or a trainer with a lot of answers. We're looking to, it's a co-discovery. We're looking to together figure out what the issue is here, what the roots of the issue are, and what we can do about it, and make it part of an ongoing dialogue, an ongoing process. Well, let's move along then to step 5, which is increasing the pull opportunities. Now, by pull, what we mean is trying to encourage and empower coachees to look for coaching, to seek coaching, that it dramatically improves when they do that and when it is much more of a two-way street. So we're trying to create the opportunities in the process to make it widely available to everybody, to maybe build it into high potential programs, or to link coaching with other training and those who want to coach. So one of the ways that we do that, here's one tool, is where we're asking the coachee to identify what would you like coaching on. This is particularly powerful for career coaching, but certainly can apply as well to performance coaching. So the second part of step 5 here is around building a coaching culture. Again, we could spend a huge amount of time on this, but it starts with having a good support infrastructure. We're a big believer in helping to build in-house expertise, and lots of organizations these days are building in-house coaching expertise and creating learning communities. So senior leaders need to clearly buy in. We do off-site retreats. We do a variety of things to try to help the senior team buy in and take a lead role in the kind of culture they're trying to build. Then we want to build skills and look for ways to measure the progress of those skills. And we want to, on the part of the employees or more frontline people, get them to look for coaching, create opportunities for coaching, and have them really own a lot of the coaching that's going on and the outcomes from it. So lastly, we'll talk briefly about monitoring and measuring and how we can strengthen accountability. So to do that, we'll come back for a little bit and think about, well, what are the key elements of extraordinary coaches? So here's what we've seen, and here's what can be measured. the degree that people feel the coach really cares about their progress. Does the coach really believe, come from a value set, that people can grow and change and improve, or does the coach believe that everybody kind of shows up with things pretty well set? We need to get focused on the future. Is the coach not just trying to solve today's problem, but trying to move us forward and going beyond just the immediate job? Is the coach trying to pull solutions from the coachee or work together to solve the issue rather than believing that they need to own it? This ideally is part of shorter ongoing conversations. It's not just once in a while or just once a year at performance appraisal time, that we're doing this on an ongoing basis, and the coachee feels that ongoing support and ongoing encouragement. So those are the kind of the overall attributes that we can look at, and so there are lots of different ways to measure that. There's certainly informal ways to measure it with anecdotes or with observations, and then there's a variety of surveys of different sorts and different kinds of scorecards, and through the performance management process, we can get a stronger sense of to what extent this is occurring. So in wrapping up the discussion of the extraordinary coach, here's one other organization that's been using this for a while, talking again about the FUEL framework and how this has been so helpful for them in creating an overall coaching culture. So what are the next steps from here? We've covered a lot of ground and very quickly have taken you through a broad overview of these two topic areas of building leadership skills and coaching culture. So where do we go? Well, any of you in Southern Ontario, in and around the Toronto area, if you live here or if you're going to be traveling here around the first part of April, then you're welcome to join us for a morning. I'm going to basically go through a much deeper discussion of what we've just covered, and there'll be a chance for more interaction and to look a lot further at this topic area. There's no charge for this briefing. It's complimentary. We will send you a follow-up link in the email for it. We also have a series of one-day workshops that are fairly rare public workshops. We don't do a lot of public workshops because primarily this work is done in-house, a lot of times tailored to an organization. But every once in a while we do these public sessions. And so we're doing one on the extraordinary leader, which is using the strength-based approach and the 360 and so on that I talked about earlier, and one on the extraordinary coach, which is built primarily around that four-stage FUEL framework and the concepts that I've just covered. So that's coming up May 5th and 6th in Richmond, BC, which is just where the airport is located in BC, so it's very easy to get to in the lower mainland. Then I'll be heading on up to Edmonton later that week and be on the 8th and 9th in Edmonton. And then the following week we'll be in Mississauga, just around the airport, Dixie Road, and the 401 area, which is also where the briefing is taking place on the 3rd. So you can go to our website, to the coming events section, get lots more information, register for any of this, and we will as well be sending out a follow-up email, which will have some of this information in it. So watch for this email, and if you complete a survey, we'll be sending you a survey asking for some of your feedback, experiences, observations around what we've just covered here today. So if you complete that survey, we'll put you in a draw for one copy each of How to Be Exceptional and the Extraordinary Coach. There will also, I mentioned a few times, links to white papers, articles, blogs. We have quite a lot of material available. We'll provide those links for you, and you can go browse and pull out what makes the most sense for you. We'll as well do have some past archives that we can link you to, and you can take a look at some of the other topic areas related to this. And I mentioned the, well, in the email, we'll have more information on this briefing, the Mississauga briefing, and the public workshops that are happening in Toronto, Calgary, and Edmonton. And if you want to contact us as well, Brad Smith has just joined us recently. He's going to be at the briefing in Mississauga. Brad is Director of Business Development, so he's going to be with me in Mississauga, and Brad and I are very much open to having exploratory conversations, even just at the very early stages of does this fit or not fit, or how does this work, or any sorts of questions that you might have. We'd be happy to talk those over with you. As well, we'll have a link to, this is actually the publisher's website, McGraw-Hill, and they have up to 40% discounts on the books. So we'll have that in the email if you'd like to purchase these books at a substantial discount. Well, I have, the clock has just clicked over here to finishing on time, try to have on-time performance. We have taken a real rush bus tour around the city and raced from one stop to the next. Hopefully you've had a bit of a chance to take a few photos and to get some insights into these areas. There's lots more to see, lots more to dig down into, and we'd be happy to work with you to do that. And thank you for joining us today.